All right, good afternoon or good morning if you're on the West Coast. Welcome to the monthly UC San Francisco Stanford Center of Excellence in Regulatory Innovation and Science on the cybersecurity for biomedical engineering. This is joint with the Food and Drug Administration. My name is Kevin Fu, and I'll be your moderator today. So let's get into a few introductory remarks about our special panel of physicians today. And let me set a little background for just why are we here and talking about cybersecurity of medical devices. First, a disclaimer. This seminar series does not represent official FDA policy or guidance, and the contents are those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the official views of, nor an endorsement by FDA, HHS, or the US government. This seminar is being recorded, and you will be able to view it within a few days on YouTube. And you can find that on the CERSI website where you registered. Again, my name is Kevin Fu. I'm Associate Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at the University of Michigan. I also direct the Archimedes Center for Medical Device Security. And you can find me online on LinkedIn is probably the best way. And I'm pleased to be your moderator today. So why are we here? I think most of us are here because we know of the vexing challenges to protect the cybersecurity of medical devices and healthcare delivery. There was a news article that came out earlier this year in the Wall Street Journal. This was just in March of 2022, where there was an interesting schism within the Conti ransomware group. The Conti is a type of ransomware that was very prevalent. Millions of dollars extorted through ransomware. But what was interesting about the Conti ransomware group is that it was based in Russia. And there was a schism within the group after the war broke out in Ukraine, where pro-Ukrainian hackers outed the pro-Russian hackers. And in particular, they decided to post the chats, the private chats of the hacker group. And you can see that the hackers were talking about disabling more than 400 US hospitals and trying to cause panic. So cybersecurity threats are no longer academic. They are no longer hypothetical. They are no longer just kids in the basement toying around with systems. These are now organized crime and nation states who are trying to cause harm. So what can we do about this when we have not only the problem of certain nation state level adversaries, but also just software that can fall to run-of-the-mill malware? Well, in the United States, FDA and Congress have been working together on trying to figure out how, from a legislative perspective and through an executive order perspective or lens, to improve cybersecurity. And so in May of 2021, the Biden administration issued an executive order that primarily affects the ability to sell software to the federal government, requiring things like software bill of materials, use of zero trust, and so on and so forth. Senators and Congress have also introduced draft legislation to require certain things about medical device security during pre-market review, and that is an ongoing legislative process. Earlier this year, in April, the Food and Drug Administration issued its long-awaited guidance, draft guidance on cybersecurity in medical devices. I would call it pre-market. These are the pre-market draft recommendations or quality system considerations, and the content of those pre-market submissions. This is a guidance document, pre-market, not for implementation yet, but it went out for public comment. That public comment period ended in July, and my understanding is that FDA is now processing those public comments. I do not speak for the Food and Drug Administration. I completed my term as Acting Director of Medical Device Security in May of earlier this year, but I can say that this is an extremely important document in terms of what to expect in the future about good security for the review process for 510Ks, PMAs, and so forth, for manufacturers who wish to show that they have appropriately managed the cybersecurity risks in the midst of everything going on with not only nation states, but untargeted malware that can affect the safety and efficacy of medical devices. So that sets the stage for why we're here today. We've had a number of expert speakers come to us, some from the academic cybersecurity community, some from the medical community. And today, we're going to try something special. We're going to have a panel discussion today. And participants, we have about 100 people so far joined, are welcome to submit questions through the Q&A function. The chat function is not enabled for this particular webinar, but through the Q&A, you can submit questions. Comments, you're welcome to comment. We won't be accepting comments today, but we will be looking at questions that I believe are going to be interesting to bring forward to the panelists. So you're welcome to submit questions for consideration. Before we get started, I would like to introduce our 4 physician panelists, and then each panelist is going to have some opening remarks before we get into a discussion. What I'd like to first say is that we have 4 physicians from entirely different sub-disciplines of the practice of medicine. So in alphabetical order, we have Dr. Christian Dameff. He is at the University of California, San Diego in the health system there. He works in emergency medicine. Let me tell you a little bit about him before we go on through the entire panel. He's an assistant professor of emergency medicine, among other positions he holds, and he was hired as the nation's first medical director of cybersecurity at UC San Diego. He's published clinical works, including cardiac arrest care. He's also a hacker and a security researcher. And so you'll often find him in venues such as DEF CON, Black Hat, RSA, and B-Sides. And you will find him there running important events, as well as co-founding the CyberMed Summit along with Jeff Tully for the novel multidisciplinary conference with an emphasis on medical device and infrastructure cybersecurity. Our second panelist, Dr. Dan Kramer, is from the Harvard Medical School. He is an electrophysiologist from cardiology, and he studied philosophy actually at Brown University before getting his MD from Harvard. And he completed his internal medicine training at the Massachusetts General Hospital. He's presently, I believe, in London, and I believe it's a different world of practicing medicine out there in London at this moment. He's also a member of the Cardiac Electrophysiology Service at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, where he is part of the Richard and Susan Smith Center for Outcomes Research in Cardiology. His research focuses on the ethics, policy, and clinical outcomes related to the use of cardiac devices. Our next panelist is Dr. Erika Petersen. She is from the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, and her specialty is neurosurgery. Dr. Petersen directs the section of functional and restorative neurosurgery at Arkansas, and she's a board-certified neurosurgeon whose clinical practice focuses on neuromodulation, treating movement disorders, spasticity, and chronic pain through surgical procedures and stereotactic surgery. So what I like to say with Dr. Petersen is, it's not brain surgery, but she's a brain surgeon. So quite amazing. Her research interests focus on using high-resolution imaging to understand the functional interaction of centers within the brain, among other things. But she's also a researcher on security and privacy as it relates to neuromodulation devices. And she has some very interesting insights, especially on the topic of privacy and control of these devices to keep them secure. Moving on, Dr. Jeff Tully is at the University of California, San Diego as well. He is in anesthesiology. He is an assistant clinical professor of anesthesiology at UC San Diego Health. And he is a practicing physician and also a security researcher working between and interacting with both the medicine and technology communities to make healthcare safer for patients everywhere. He's an anesthesiologist, a pediatrician, and a computer security researcher, also attending events and organizing events at DEF CON and other related conferences. Prior to medical school, he worked on hacking the genetic code of Salmonella, among other things. And he works in this new era where we now, as a community, need to protect the security of remote care, remote telemetry, implantable medical devices, and biohacking. So it's my pleasure to welcome this very distinguished panel of 4 physicians. And I would we're going to go alphabetically through the panelists for some opening remarks. We're going to begin with Dr. Dameff, who has some oral remarks.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for this opportunity, as well as this phenomenal panel you've put together. I'm excited for the questions that'll be forthcoming and the dialogue that'll happen between all of these experts, as well as the audience out there. I really wanted to bring up 2 to 3 specific points that might not be very relevant to, or may not be very obvious, I should say, to many people that are just getting into this space. It's clear in my time in researching this that there are some pretty siloed independent stakeholder groups. There's often the medical device manufacturing space, mostly interacting with other medical device manufacturers, healthcare delivery organizations, and patients, but the primary focus of that group is usually regulatory compliance. And Dr. Fu had mentioned previously documents such as the pre-market guidance and the post-market guidance and others is the primary preoccupation of that stakeholder group. Then you'll have the more infrastructure side. You'll have the security practitioners at particular health centers, for instance. These are the chief information security officers, others that actually do the practical cybersecurity of hospitals. And their primary preoccupation tends to be with infrastructure security, concerns about ransomware, and the operational demands of securely deploying medical devices. Recently, I would say in the last 5 or 6 years, has now been an additional stakeholder group added to this conversation, which are the clinicians, the clinical staff, the nurses, the doctors, and others taking care of the patients that are, in my opinion, a little bit late to the game. But what they bring to this conversation is really a discussion about the patient safety implications. Truly, the paradigm prior to about 10 years or so was entirely focused on the securing of patient data and the privacy concerns. And although those are very important concerns, and more engagement from the clinical side has raised more concerning patient safety impacts, truly where the bits and bytes meet flesh and blood. So now that's the kind of background to what I wanted to discuss, which are really 2 issues. One, that as we recognize how interconnected and interdependent our clinical care is on these technical systems, and again, that's only increasing. Previously mentioned things like remote monitoring at home, wearables, the advancement of connected implantable medical devices, the infrastructure of hospital care delivery being almost entirely digitized at this point. That's only increasing, is that the dependency of outside groups, companies, software products, as well as the ecosystem of healthcare delivery organizations around a particular hospital are posing some very unique concerns. And let me give you a specific example of that. Last year in San Diego, a large healthcare delivery organization of 4 hospitals, many dozens of outpatient facilities, including 3 stroke centers and a trauma center, got hit with ransomware. This devastating attack took down these hospitals for about a month to various degrees. Their inability, the ransomware was so disruptive that for a majority of the first week of the attack, almost all the hospitals went on bypass. They were sending patients to other facilities. Those stroke centers that would normally be the closest location for a patient to get stroke care, which is, a very timely and resource intensive clinical care workflow, had to send those to other adjacent hospitals. Why am I bringing up this attack last year and talking about how devastating it was? Well, it's because that diversion or inability for them to take care of those sick patients forced other hospitals in the region to pick up the slack. And that is a very important and natural thing. I mean, it's not just cyber attacks that can do that, natural disasters, even technological failures that aren't cybersecurity in nature, just the power outages, fires, other types of things can cause those similar disruptions. But the novelty of this is the following, that that impact was not a day or 2, it lasted for a month. And that's what we've seen recently in targeted ransomware attacks, as mentioned earlier by Dr. Fu, which is the norm now. Conti ransomware gang was targeting healthcare facilities. When they did attack them, they did so in a way to intentionally cause prolonged downtime to further force the extortion of money out of these hospitals. So these downtimes from ransomware targeting hospitals is lasting longer. That diversion and pressure in the ecosystems around those hospitals is quite significant. And what I'd like to just talk about now is this reality of this world we have where it's not just your own internal cybersecurity at your organization that you have to worry about. Truly, we should be looking at things at a regional level. We should be looking at critical access hospitals. We should be looking at strategic points in our national healthcare infrastructure that, if targeted, could cause delays or degraded patient care. So that's the first thing I wanted to bring up, is just really this increasing interdependency, ransomware ecosystem effects, and that we're all in the same boat. We really need to come together to build regional resiliency as well as individual hospital resiliency. The second is really, now with this infusion of more clinicians into this space and the insight that they bring on clinical care, we are starting to recognize that it's not just the obvious scenario on television that you see of a particular medical device getting attacked and someone getting harmed because of a change in a drug dose, for example, or a shock from a pacemaker AICD. Really, what we're trying to see, what we're starting to see now with more insight from clinicians, is really the whole host of ways that cyber attacks can impact patients. And I wanted to just quickly take a few minutes to talk about what does that mean and what are we talking about in that regard. You can harm a patient a variety of ways. You can failure to access care can cause harm. If you're having a heart attack or you're having a stroke, you can't get to a hospital. That delay in care or lack of access of care could be the difference between a stroke victim walking or talking or potentially even living. Same thing for a patient having a heart attack. These time-sensitive, critically ill patients, they need quick access to care. So if a cyber attack, for instance, impacts the emergency medical services or ambulance infrastructure of a municipality, that lack of access of care can cause harm. So the second would be delays in care, kind of akin to the first point. But if, for instance, you're being cared for at a hospital that's under a ransomware attack and the laboratory system is no longer available, your diagnosis could be delayed because the infrastructure cannot produce timely results for physicians to act upon. So delays in diagnosis. You can get misdiagnosed. So because of the lack of diagnostics, or because those results of those various diagnostics have been altered, for instance, an integrity attack, those you can be misdiagnosed. You could then not receive the appropriate treatment or be harmed by receiving treatment that you shouldn't receive in the first place because you actually didn't have that condition. Why am I talking about this in different ways? It's because I think it's really important for us to realize and surface these types of different ways that patients can be harmed by cyber attacks so that we can raise awareness, visibility, and build structures around these types of possibilities to actually to detect them when they happen. That's the next thing I wanted to say is these ecosystem effects. Two, there are many ways to harm a patient when you start developing better telemetry systems to capture all ways that patients can be harmed. And then the last thing I'll bring up before passing on the torch here is just that we need more rigorous academic study of this. This is one of the biggest things that frustrates me about this space. There is not rigorous, evidence-based decision-making that's happening regarding healthcare cybersecurity. A lot of it's expert opinion, a lot of it's where's the political wind, what gets released in the media. What I think we need is a far more robust, sustainable, and rigorous academic study of healthcare cybersecurity effects to produce the best data to then make decisions. So what I would encourage as a matter of policy is really something like exploring National Institute of Health NIH funding, talking about collaborations between that and the National Science Foundation to study this issue of medical device cybersecurity, healthcare infrastructure cybersecurity with the same academic rigor that we apply to other things like epidemiologic study of diseases and things, so that we can really make the best decisions. And those are the 3 points I wish to bring.
Thank you for those opening remarks, Christian. We'll next turn to Dr. Dan Kramer, and let me stop my screen share so that he can share. He has some slides he'd like to present.
Great. Hi, everybody. Well, thanks so much for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm Dan Kramer, and as Kevin described, I'm a cardiac electrophysiologist at the Beth Israel in Boston. And I just want to ground this concept around medical device cybersecurity in the particular clinical context where I work. And we'll skip the disclosure slide just for time. But so in my space, where we usually think about security concerns is in the area of remote monitoring. So as many of you may know, most pacemakers and defibrillators are capable of some kind of remote monitoring. And the newer systems do so predominantly through wireless transmission. That can be either through Bluetooth or radio frequency. That can be through a standalone base station in patients' homes, or increasingly through apps on their phones. The idea is that a lot of data gets transmitted to their clinicians, some of it driven by patients, some of it automatically without their knowing it, some of it in response to alert conditions about device malfunction. And all of that data flows to us almost continuously. And this is worth doing. This is important. And just at the bottom, we can see a couple examples of the kind of information that we get from these remote monitoring systems, which we might not get at all, or we might get late with potentially devastating consequences. So on the left is an example of a measurement that the device does automatically of the wire integrity. This shows a sudden change in impedance, which in this case suggests that the lead touching the patient's heart and providing all of their pacing or defibrillation needs has actually fractured. And you get a sudden change here, and we can get that as an alert and figure it out before the patient is harmed. On the right is what it looks like from inside a defibrillator when a patient has a sudden dangerous heart rhythm that is then shocked, and that brings the patient back to life. Patients sometimes, but not always, notice these, and we are able to find out about it often even before the patients knew that these things happen. So this is important, and it's worth doing. And I think it's important to recognize that for observing core device functions in general, we think that it's worth introducing some safety and security vulnerabilities by making these kinds of remote systems available. But the way the technology has evolved, it's been so quick and so powerful that we now can collect a lot of information that's moved well beyond the core function of either a pacemaker, sort of preventing your heart from being too slow, or a defibrillator, preventing your heart from being too fast, such that now devices can collect all kinds of extra things. We know how active patients are. You can actually, in some devices, measure heart sounds as a decibels. You can hear how hearts are beating. You can look at other ambient arrhythmias, some of which are important, but some perhaps we would have preferred not to know about. You can measure transthoracic impedance, which is a metric for heart failure measurement, autonomic measures. You can even measure temperature in some of these devices. What that's actually useful for, I'm not entirely clear, but you can do it. The graph over here on the right shows that this is from a patient's defibrillator. Again, it's really only there to resuscitate that patient from sudden death. It should it occur, but it's collecting all of this other information. In this particular patient context, this shows a change in his heart rate over time, as well as his physical activity going up and then dwindling down, and change in some of his autonomic measures. And this is actually the device recording a clinical trajectory of a patient slowly dying, in this case of advanced end-stage heart failure. That's not why he had the device, but because of remote monitoring, we're getting all this extra information. And that remote connectivity is allowing us to do a few limited things that I think introduce some new potential security concerns that people in my field are worried about. We can do a little bit of remote reprogramming, not for pacemakers or defibrillators, but for implantable loop recorders, where the reprogramming stakes are a little bit lower. You can do some very limited reprogramming to facilitate making it safe for a patient with a pacemaker or a defibrillator to get an MRI. In fact, some of that work can actually be done autonomously by the devices themselves to sense the magnetic environment, reprogram themselves, and then fix it after the patient leaves an MRI. So there's some opportunity, I think, to leverage new technology to make patients' experiences of care better. But I also think that there's a tension here around whether sort of more is always better, or if we should reground what we're asking these devices to do and how connected they are in the primary clinical reason for their being there. And I would contrast your pacemakers and defibrillators to another area of digital health or digital connectivity where maybe more is more. And so these are just a few of the screenshots I get every time I go for a run. I use just a Garmin watch and a Power Foot Pod, and I get some of the stuff that you would expect to see, like elevation changes, how fast I'm running, what my heart rate is doing, some AI-driven thing called performance condition, which I think is largely made to make me feel bad about myself, actually. You get all this other stuff too that I'm actually not sure what it means, sort of some of these power measures like ground time and vertical oscillation, what form power is, I'm not sure, but collecting all this extra information and routing it through the servers managed by these companies, it's unlikely to hurt me. There's some privacy things there maybe, but it's not likely to hurt me. But I worry a little bit about whether the kinds of technology that we're now imposing on a core cardiac implantable device system that is primarily there just to save patients' lives, to prevent life-threatening conditions from in fact being fatal, whether expanding their connectivity introduces security risks out of proportion to the potential benefits to patients. So looking forward to hearing the rest of the panel and discussing more of this at length. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those opening remarks, Dan, and I'll have to catch you on the running app. Next, we have Dr. Erika Petersen, and I believe you can share your screen.
Thank you so much, and I really enjoyed the other remarks so far. I'm joining you from an airport, so forgive my mask. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I wanted to just peel the screen back a little bit on what the perspective is from a neurosurgical point of view, because that is something that for most people is a little different. You think about brain surgery sort of as a thing that is been around for a while, but there's actually a lot of real technology to it. At this point, what we're talking about is a technologically dependent operating room. This is a case where we're using a navigation, computer-assisted way of looking through an endoscope into the brain, and you can look at how many screens there are, drills and other things that are all within the operative suite that are all requiring electronic function, computer regulation of their function, and that really takes into every phase of taking care of patients, from imaging use before, during, and after surgery, to the monitoring that we do in the ICU, the diagnostic testing that we do, and then implanted neuromodulation devices. And I was really happy to hear Dr. Kramer's discussion, because the cardiac space has really started with that, but we're starting to see some of the same monitoring features and opportunities to collect data that we're not sure what to do with and whether or not we should be aggregating it, and therefore encountering the privacy and ethical issues associated with it. The other piece of what we worry about is what Christian talked about, which is what happens when things turn off. And my highest priority here is that I need to be able to do a life-saving brain surgery. And if the drill that I use requires pinging the internet in order to work, I will not be able to use my equipment effectively. And so the concern here is there needs to be an offline dumb mode or safe mode from which we can continue to proceed, even if we don't have access to all the advanced technology suite that is intended for the device as it works as its best. Just a few other examples of how we use this. So this is some of the stereotactic work that we do using MRI imaging here to specifically target areas within the brain. We use robots in order to help aim the precision of where the spinal instrumentation, the rods and screws that people have during spinal fusions. We also do deep brain stimulation, where I'm starting to implant stem cells for regenerative medication, regenerative treatments. There are a lot of places where we encounter this. These are specific lesions. You can see here, this outline is of an area where we are using a thermal injury, computer controlled, and with real-time MRI readings of temperature within the brain to destroy the focus of where epilepsy is starting for this patient who has a seizure disorder. And similarly, we can use targeted radiation beams to focus on and burn a tumor within a brain while leaving the surrounding brain tissue effectively safe. You can imagine what a perturbation of even just a few millimeters or a few degrees of temperature might do in terms of destruction of tissue in that area where that precision was really essential for safety. When it comes to robot surgical assistance, I use these to aim within millimeter accuracy within the brain in order to place a brain stimulation electrode to treat Parkinson's, for example. We also do this in order to safely place the screws for spinal fusion, and being off by even a millimeter or two can cause significant problems in terms of quality of patient's experience, as well as possible complications. So the registration, the fidelity, and the trustworthiness of these tools that we use is really essential. The area that I think this is most important, and this overlaps again with what Dan was talking about, is implanted devices. And these three areas include spinal cord stimulation, which is an implanted device like a pacemaker for pain. The electrodes here go into the spinal canal instead of into the heart. We also have deep brain stimulation, where the electrodes go within the brain tissue itself. And then we have intrathecal drug delivery pumps. These automatically deliver medication into the spinal fluid. You can think of these in the same sort of category as an insulin pump. They're continuously delivering. They require an internal pump, rotor, and computer system in order to make them work. And a malfunction by overdosing or underdosing medications can be extremely hazardous to the patient. When you talk about collection of data, this is an area where privacy and ethics are really important, and something that I wish I had more time to cover today, but we have two examples of that right now. One is recordable stimulation for epilepsy, where small electrodes within the brain are connected to the neurostimulator, which reads a continuous EEG electrical tracing of brainwave activity. When you start to see abnormalities, just like the heart device, you see a deployed electrical charge and a resumption of the normal electrical activity to abort a seizure from happening. We also have stimulation within Parkinson's, where we can read the brain responsiveness and tune the device so that it optimizes and has an automatic regulation of how well a stimulator is actually helping to control movement. And we have a very new device, which is just FDA approved about 6 months ago, which does the same thing in order to stimulate for patients with chronic pain using a closed loop spinal cord stimulator. These devices are starting to collect some of the same sort of data as far as temperature, position, activity, time for activation, how often the patient is recharging a rechargeable device. And there are a lot of places where there are potentials of failure. For me in the operating room, I worry about denial of service, and that's access to my patient's chart, it's access to my X-ray records, it's access to the ability to use the cranial drills and other instruments that I need to use, as I showed you. But we also talk about unauthorized data access. What about control of a device or interruption of a device function? And finally, misappropriation of data. These data are being collected and aggregated in many cases by the companies that manufacture the devices under a HIPAA business agreement. But what happens when the companies change hands, or what if somehow some of those data are misdirected, or even if they're just used in a way but that was outside of the original consent process for which they were obtained? So in conclusion, I think there's a whole lot of ways that we in neurosurgery are encountering some of these same questions, and I look forward to the discussion that we're about to have. Thank you again, Dr. Fu, for having me.
Thank you so much for the perspectives from neurosurgery. Okay, we are going to turn now to Dr. Jeff Tully, who has a few opening remarks to make.
Well, again, thank you so much for the invitation. I don't know that any of us would be here if it weren't for the pioneering work that you did, Dr. Fu, to kind of kick off this entire field. So it's really an honor and just an incredible panel that I'm thankful to be a part of. I do want to get to questions, and so I'll keep this relatively short, but I think we've talked about a lot of issues that are very fascinating from the standpoint of the data that these devices are collecting. And I think we're really starting to see patients enter some of these conversations as well. And so I just want to highlight on kind of a really interesting dialogue that we're seeing with groups of patients and medical device manufacturers when it comes to certain types of implantable devices like we discussed. Particularly, there's been some incredible progress in the treatment of type 1 diabetes by patients who are using continuous glucose monitors. So they're able to see what their blood sugar levels are without having to prick themselves multiple times a day. And then they're also working with insulin pumps that can deliver a variable amount of insulin to help regulate that blood sugar. And so the use of these two devices has really constituted a closed loop system in recent years, which can be pretty incredible on how it will replicate some of the functionality of the diseased pancreas for these types of patients. And we have research that shows that the clinical outcomes are better when using these systems compared to the traditional way of dosing insulin when it comes to things like control of blood sugar. And some of the early pioneers in this type of system were actually patients themselves who took advantage of security vulnerabilities in insulin pumps. to basically homebrew this closed loop system well in advance of any commercial platforms or FDA clearance or approval of these types of systems. And so there's still a subset of these patients that are very vocal about their desire to have access to and control of the data that is produced by the functionality of these devices. And we're starting to see this in some of the other realms as well. And so there are people out there who are advocating for open source software and interoperability across devices. And there's some interesting conversations that are going back and forth between these types of patients and the industry, which has sort of traditionally adopted a posture that increasing accessibility may also increase the attack surface when it comes to cybersecurity vulnerabilities. And I think the FDA has done a really great job in some of the pre-market guidance and then just in some of the conversations that we've had of sort of navigating between these types of considerations and really feeling like there is a possibility for us to improve the cybersecurity of our devices while also making sure that that patients can have increasing autonomy and accessibility with some of the data generated. So lots of other things we could talk about, but I'd like to definitely move it along to get to some of these questions.
Thank you, Jeff. So appreciate all these opening remarks, and we're going to get into a discussion here. We have 4 different disciplines of medicine represented in this panel, which I just find amazing to have this opportunity to speak with you. I'd like to tease out a little bit about similarities and differences, and maybe we can just start, and anyone's welcome to unmute and just go. But what does cybersecurity mean to you for your disease discipline, and in what way might it have certain unique elements to your field of medicine?
I can go ahead and start. I promise this time I'll make it brief. Really, with emergency medicine, I think we are focusing on infrastructure cybersecurity. So really the more recent concerns about ransomware attacks uniquely target my specialty because we never close. We are a 24/7, 365 operation. The emergency department exists for the purpose of making sure we treat some time-sensitive, life-threatening conditions. And so the availability of those critical systems is something that uniquely, and I don't think uniquely, but I'm sorry, significantly impacts my particular specialty of medicine. We are also a field that is highly reliant on diagnostic technologies like laboratory studies and images, and as well as the full-time availability of medical records to deliver care. The ransomware attack I mentioned that happened last year in our region actually impacted our ability to access shared medical records between organizations, further impeding our ability to take care of the patients that were shunted over to us because of their ransomware attack. And so at the end of the day, I think with emergency medicine, if we don't have the tools, namely our laboratory studies, our imaging, and some of our external medical records, treating time-sensitive life-threatening medical conditions can be more difficult. And so I think we are more on the side of healthcare infrastructure attacks being hugely impactful to the entire discipline of emergency medicine. I will also say we have a subdiscipline of emergency medicine called disaster medicine. We can train even more to learn how to study and treat patients during disasters. And it's part of our training pathway to become proficient in that. And so I think that's where we normally would focus on as emergency medicine physicians, is how do we alleviate those concerns in the middle of these types of disasters, truly cyber disasters.
And I want to come back to that in a future question about training and some of the not only tabletop, but operating room tabletop cybersecurity exercises. Maybe I'll pick on Dr. Petersen since you're in an airport. But when you hear the word cybersecurity in your specialty, what are some of the properties that come to mind first for you that affect your discipline?
Yeah, so I think the majority of neurosurgeons think about it in terms of the ransomware attack because we don't get a lot of training, we don't get a lot of education in terms of the cybersecurity piece of it. We, like every other hospital employee, have to do our phishing protection, cybersecurity caution training from the hospital every year. And that's really sort of what is at the front of mind. And so part of what I've been really motivated to highlight is what I just talked about, which is this really encompasses all of the devices that we use, all the equipment that we use, and understanding where we can be in terms of contingency planning on that. The other thing that I think is important when you talk about really niche specialty technology that we are trying to apply is that some of this comes from single product, small startup companies. And as you increase regulatory burdens and as you potentially switch to a new platform or upgrade what actually needs to go into SBOM communications or something like that, it may well be that these companies are going to be marginalized in a place where they cannot keep up. And then we end up having obsolete equipment that either is not up to date, and we have to make a strategic decision to continue to use non-compliant equipment because it is the thing that will accomplish what we need to for a patient, but we're having to make a trade-off in doing something with it. And that's where I think the contingencies of what happens in, like I said, in a dumb mode or an offline mode, or what happens when you may have something that only works on Windows 95, but you really still have to have it. And these are things that we as surgeons aren't thinking about. I think a lot of us are trusting our IT infrastructure within the institutions that we work to have done that work for us. But as we're starting to look at more and more implanted devices and how we interact with patients, I think it's important that this becomes a more prevalent conversation. And that's why I'm trying to focus on education.
Thank you for that perspective. So continuing on the topic of what does cybersecurity mean to you for your disease, for your practice of medicine, why don't we, Dr. Kramer, you work in implants as well. Maybe you can add a little more color on what does cybersecurity mean to you?
Yeah, I would echo Dr. Petersen's comment about how most clinicians who work with these devices don't have much formal training in cybersecurity or medical device security more broadly. And we put a lot of trust in the regulators who are coming up with updated guidance that you highlighted at the beginning of your remarks. And we trust the manufacturers to have done the appropriate security and privacy testing and to have implemented whatever the appropriate standards are for securing the devices, particularly the ones that are remotely connected and therefore potentially more vulnerable to certain kinds of malicious intrusion. And the other thing that comes up a lot in our specialty is that we don't want patients to be concerned about security or privacy risks out of proportion to the likelihood of their being harmed by that compared to the potential benefits of getting the device that we're recommending. And so a few years ago, there was a relatively high profile recall of one particular manufacturer's cardiac implantable devices that was raised based on some mostly theoretical cybersecurity risks that were introduced into the popular media in sort of some kind of meandering ways. And when we confronted that as a clinical committee, I think the general consensus was we don't want patients to freak out about this. We don't want people to decide that a pacemaker that we have recommended for them for their health isn't worth it to them because of this mostly theoretical cybersecurity concern. So to the extent that we want to educate ourselves and also educate our patients around what these issues are and what's real and what are things and potential safeguards that they should be taking or we should be taking as a community, we also don't want that to overshadow the benefits of these devices and scare people away from a technology that we think is good for their health.
That's a really deep point there about the utility and life-saving nature of the devices. So Jeff, I'm curious if you're more downstream. How often do you end up with a patient with an implant and maybe you don't even recognize it at first if they're not presenting something obvious? But I'm curious how cybersecurity comes up in your clinical practice, whether it's an implant or not.
Sure. So most of the time I'm working in the operating room, and my job is all about incorporating huge streams of data and making decisions based on the patterns that I see there. And so, yes, it is very common to have a patient present for surgery with one of these devices, and there's things I have to do. But just from a larger sense, I need to be able to rely on, the many different types of connected devices that I use to monitor their vital signs, that I use to access medications, that I use to record what I'm doing clinically. And so from more of just an overall infrastructure standpoint, I am actually very, very dependent on a lot of this technology. And both myself and my colleagues, we don't often train for what happens when we don't have access to that technology. And so that's something that Christian and I are very interested in from a disaster planning and workflow management, is how do we educate clinicians, not just about these general concepts, but about how to best function in an environment where we may not have the tools that we depend on a regular basis.
Right. And ransomware, of course, is today's sort of #1 way to remove access to those tools. So I find it interesting that with cybersecurity, people can interpret that to mean different things. In the IT world, I would say most people equate cybersecurity with confidentiality, things like patient records. And then in the OT or operational technology world, it's usually equated with either integrity or availability. And so it's just really interesting to hear your perspectives on this, especially as ransomware gets into that. Well, I heard I took note of 3 or 4 interesting things I heard from your remarks here. And I heard a veiled remark to basically what I considered legacy medical devices. Erika, I think you mentioned Windows 95. So, you can find it running in 2 places, hospitals and the power grid. So, they're in critical infrastructure. I also heard discussion about training and the importance of training on cybersecurity matters. And I also heard a discussion about responsibility. So who's responsible when not only when something goes wrong, but who's responsible for preventative measures in terms of making sure these devices are effective? And then on a more deeper dive topic, I also heard the term SBOM come up, software bill of materials. So I'd love to talk more about these 4. We have about 13 minutes remaining, but Krishna, I wanted to return back to you about training. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of the lessons you've learned, and Jeff as well, or others as you would like, on what have you learned from training physicians on medical device security issues?
It's a great question. And Jeff, please feel free to chime in if I miss something. Long story short, we've been rather effective at using experiential learning to educate clinicians on healthcare cybersecurity. We've already talked about several times. When you talk to clinicians, we're kind of a biased sample. We, I think, to a greater degree, understand some of the cybersecurity issues with connected medical devices, but a vast majority of clinicians think about cybersecurity as the yearly training that they have to perform and click through as quickly as possible in order for them to maintain their access to their email. It's seen as a burden. It's almost entirely a preoccupation with patient safety. I'm sorry, with patient data and HIPAA compliance. So when you're trying to educate clinicians about some of these more nuanced patient safety implications of healthcare cybersecurity, you can lecture to them, not very effective. You can try to persuade them in one-to-one conversations, but you sound like a lunatic. What we've had success with is using experiential learning, usually in high-fidelity clinical simulations. So in medical education, it's a common thing to go to what's called a simulation center, to use fake actor patients and or mannequins to simulate real clinical conditions, heart attacks, strokes, surgeries, whatever it may be. And that type of high-fidelity clinical simulations are a useful tool because you get to run through a scenario that is both medically realistic and allows for a low-stakes environment. We take those simulations, we build and write ones that incorporate real cybersecurity risks into real physiology, real patient care, and we put unsuspecting clinicians through these scenarios. At the end, what we commonly see are these light bulbs going off because they experienced it, they understand through the exercise what the patient safety implications could be, and has been quite successful in persuading clinicians and educating them. It's hard to scale that, but that's what we've seen as a successful way to go forward. On a larger scale, how would you do this more systemically? I think Jeff and I are of the opinion that this should in some degree be incorporated into the medical school curriculum. We also feel like there's a lot of opportunity in the graduate medical education space to allow for part of the curriculum to incorporate this, but it's a careful, delicate balance. You don't want to turn clinicians into cybersecurity experts at the expense of teaching the latest tricks and tips and treatments and medications that are coming out. Really what you need is a careful balance between awareness and an actionable set of steps that clinicians can take if they suspect cybersecurity issues, as well as an encouragement for them to anticipate disaster-like scenarios and have contingency, the downtime disaster planning. That's my 2 cents on the education side of it. But I really think we should be incorporating this into medical education, even at an early stage.
Dr. Petersen, I believe you have a remark.
Yeah, so I totally agree as far as the training of clinicians. I think the other piece when we're talking about those of us who implant neuromodulation devices or cardiac devices or other sorts of things where these are considerations, is the next piece of education is how do we educate clinicians in order to communicate, because we have to provide informed consent to our patients about some of the risks associated with these devices. And if we're not able to have that conversation and understand ourselves as the surgeons implanting these devices, then we aren't going to be able to counsel a variably sophisticated patient population, some of whom understand, if I don't have this, I will die. And I understand the computer inside it might be buggy, and that is a trade-off. But when I do my implant procedures, most of them are for chronic conditions. So it's a different milieu and a kind of educational opportunity that may take time as opposed to the cardiac need for a pacemaker or a defibrillator device. And so that adds a whole nother level of how we educate clinicians, and then also how we start to talk to educate patients about it. And there's a real problem as to figuring out, not just within medical societies and the academic medical structure, but then also within the FDA and device manufacturers, how do we actually provide those resources for those patients who will be the end users of these implanted devices?
Yeah, so complicated. And at the same time, I'm thinking about training. There's no training for legacy medical devices, or maybe there is, but I'm kind of curious when you have fellows coming in, junior physicians coming in, and they see a Windows 95 device running. Do they just go, "Oh, okay," or isn't that a problem over there? I'm really curious about generational divides. But anyway, I'll just open it up to the panel at this point. We have about 5 minutes remaining. I know we've got a lot of topics and a lot of questions. We're not going to be able to get to them all, but especially interested in things about responsibility, resources that you might have locally within your healthcare delivery organizations for assessing security of a medical device, and things like software bill of materials, and what does that mean to you as a clinician? So I'll just open it up to the panel. Anyone who'd like to chime in on that.
Sure. So, and this is in part a question for Dr. Petersen as well, actually, which is that one of the funny things about the way remote monitoring works in my specialty is that we're getting tons and tons and tons of data from patients with pacemakers, defibrillators, standalone heart failure devices, and the like, but very little, if any, of that information flows back to patients. They can access it if they look in their medical records, which increasingly they are able to do with different degrees of detail. But patients don't get, even through a smartphone app, if that's how their data are being relayed, they can't look at the app and see anything that's anywhere close to what I can see when I look in their medical records or look in their manufacturer-specific portal where I typically would access their data. And I'm wondering, if that's also the case in neurosurgery or some of the other specialties that were mentioned about the kind of data flows, whether that seems to be only moving in one direction. And I have heard from patients increasingly that they would like the data to flow in the other direction. And while that seems like a good idea to me clinically, and I think there's a strong ethical and maybe a legal rationale for doing so, I wonder if there are important security concerns about a bidirectional flow of data that might introduce new vulnerabilities into the ecosystem that we're increasingly dependent on.
I think you're absolutely right that the trend is to have that bidirectional flow for patients who are savvy, sophisticated, and choose that, which still, for my practice, is a minority of patients. One of the places where I see that changing is particularly, for example, in patients with chronic pain who have spinal cord stimulators, a lot of that is app-based collected data. So patients are entering themselves, how I feel today, how much did I use? And that is then blended with what the device is collecting so that you have subjective and objective measures coming together. And that's then generated into a dashboard report to a clinician, but then also could be going back to a dashboard report to the patient. What the reality is that all of those sorts of opportunities right now are on the drawing board. We do not have a device that is currently available on the market. There will be probably in the next 6 months where we can start to experiment and see how that works for patients. But I think that actually the adoption of that will be potentially fairly slow and within a very selected group of high functioning pro-advocacy patients. And then the other question will be, are there people who really need to have the old school paternalistic model of my doctor tells me what is good for me kind of medicine, which is sort of how what you've described as the current unidirectional flow of medicine is all about. I still have patients who see me in the office who say, Doc, I don't care what device you use, just pick what's right. And I think that will continue to change as we see this generational trend, as Kevin, you mentioned, as people are growing up a little bit more and we're seeing new generations of both patients and clinicians coming forward.
Well, we're actually coming up on the hour. We've got about 3 minutes remaining. We could probably go on for hours just on this one topic alone. But what I think I'd like to do, just to bring some closure to some topics, is give each panelist a few moments, just to 30 seconds or so on any final remarks you'd like to have, and maybe how we can continue to this type of discussion and hopefully in an in-person forum in the future. So maybe I'll work backwards this time. Dr. Tully, put you on the spot. Any final remarks you'd like to offer to our attendees?
I would just say that it's been really reassuring to see some of these cybersecurity issues move from the realm of data privacy and go into really more of a patient safety oriented mindset. And I would encourage everybody to feel like they are part of the patient safety team. We all have a role and responsibility, whether we're writing code for these devices or using them clinically. So I really appreciate the teamwork and the collaboration to all understand that we do what's in the best interest of patients.
Thank you. Dr. Petersen.
Thank you again, and I really enjoyed hearing the perspective. In this time just flew by from all of these esteemed panelists. I would say that my push is towards talking about privacy. While we're always going to have to dealing with a moving line in the sand when it comes to the potential cybersecurity threats to the integrity of devices, that as we get more and more data and as that is streaming all across the internet of connected medical things, understanding where privacy leaks are and what the potential misappropriation of those data and misuse of those data can mean for safety overall and for patient autonomy will be the bigger issue.
Thank you. Dr. Kramer.
Yeah, I think maybe extending both of those prior themes, I hope that while there should still continue to be as much energy and excitement as there has been around innovating in the implantable medical devices, applying them to new conditions, having them able to do more for patients who have unmet needs, I hope that stays in front of creating technology that brings in new vulnerabilities or security weaknesses that are beyond the scope of what we want those devices to do. And so just as Dr. Petersen was describing, having more and more devices sort of part of that Internet of Things that don't need to be connected in that way to serve a particular clinical need, that's what would worry me. So I hope that the innovation that continues in this space puts patient needs first and then has the technology fit that pathway of necessity rather than the other way around.
Dr. Dameff.
I just want to echo again, thanks, and also optimism that how quickly this hour went by and all the great insights and breadth of different cybersecurity issues that we've talked to across all these specialties. Again, I think just speaks to the need for increased collaboration, more regular work together and research across medical specialty disciplines, and then to collaborate with the larger stakeholders, regulators, healthcare delivery organizations, et cetera, how important this work is. And so I think you've done a great job here of bringing together all these voices, and it just again reinforces the need for us to get working on all these really important issues.
All right. Well, I'm so sad the hour has already come to a close. I'd like to continue the discussion, but I'd like to thank the panelists for joining, taking time out of their busy clinical day. Also, the participants for listening. Next month, our speaker on December 15th will be Michelle Jump, who's an expert in regulatory affairs for medical device security. She's the recently appointed CEO of MedSec. So she'll be joining us next month. And if you'd like to learn more, again, look us up on the UC San Francisco CERC website for cybersecurity, or you can find most of us on LinkedIn or what's left of Twitter, and be glad to interact with you there. So I apologize we're not able to get to all questions, but maybe we'll be able to respond to some of these questions asynchronously after the panel. So thank you, and have a good rest of your day.